I still remember those days before everything changed, when life was a careful balance of routine and the unexpected. My name is Bruce Carter, and looking back now, I never would have guessed that the calm before the storm was actually just a prelude to chaos. For 32 years, I served as a Marine, facing some of the toughest situations imaginable overseas. That military life left its mark on me, instilling discipline and a deep sense of responsibility, qualities that later guided me when I started my own security company after retiring. At home, things were much simpler, yet filled with their own kind of challenges. My wife, Diana, was the heart of our world. Before I was a Marine, before I became the hardened guy you might picture from my years in uniform, Diana was known for her grace and beauty. Once, she even took part in beauty contests, a far cry from the life of calm support and impeccable care she provided as a mother and partner. Even as I wrestled with memories of conflict and loss from my time abroad, Diana's unwavering warmth was my safe haven. Our son, Jonathan, was always a reminder of hope and continuity. At 24, he's now carving his own path in the legal world, studying law with a focus that reflects the intensity of his upbringing. I sometimes wonder if his decision to pursue justice was influenced by all the times I had to rely on the law to keep order in the chaotic situations I'd witnessed on duty. In many ways, I see his dedication as a bridge between the worlds of my past and his future, a legacy of service and duty, though channeled in a different way. And then there were the people who rounded out our close-knit circle. My best friend, Mark Reed, isn't your average acquaintance. Over the years, Mark built his empire in the investment world, becoming a millionaire through sheer determination and a knack for spotting opportunities. His success was a constant reminder that life had many avenues to explore. His son, Austin, was like a brother to Jonathan. Their friendship was a steady, uncomplicated bond amid the complex adult responsibilities we all eventually had to face. Austin, an economics student, always had a sharp, analytical mind, and I often found myself nodding along as he explained the subtleties of market trends at family gatherings. Those early days were, in a sense, deceptively ordinary. I'd sit back on our porch, a cold drink in hand, and watch Diana and Jonathan go about their routines, thinking that we'd somehow managed to capture the perfect balance in our lives. But behind that seemingly idyllic existence, I knew all too well that my past was never far behind me. The lessons of the battlefield, the weight of decisions made under pressure, these were never truly left behind, lingering like shadows even in moments of peace. I recall evenings filled with laughter, the kind that only comes when old friends like Mark drop by unannounced, swapping stories of high-stakes business deals and near-miss investments. There was something almost comforting about these moments, a reminder that while I had seen the worst of humanity in conflict zones, there was also a side of life that celebrated success, friendship, and the relentless pursuit of something better. I suppose what's most striking is how these pieces of my life, military service, family, and steadfast friendships, seemed so distinct at the time, each following its own rhythm, its own narrative arc. Yet, as I would come to learn later, every element was intricately connected, setting the stage for events that would soon upend everything I thought I knew about stability and control. Looking back now, before the storm hit, I felt a sense of pride in the life we had built. Every laugh shared at the dinner table, every story from the field, every bit of wisdom passed down from a friend who had weathered his own storms. It all seemed part of an elaborate tapestry, one that I didn't know was about to be torn apart and rewoven into something entirely unexpected. In those quiet moments, as I watched Diana moving gracefully around our home and Jonathan buried in his law books, I often wondered if the world would ever let me forget the burdens of my past. Little did I know that the storm looming on the horizon wasn't just a metaphor. It was about to change everything in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine. I never imagined that the one person I trusted most could be hiding secrets that would shatter our world. For over 25 years, my wife, Diana, carried a secret so deep that even in our most intimate moments, I was oblivious. It all began after my first long business trip, a time when the loneliness of my absence seemed to stretch on forever. Diana, in her vulnerable state, sought solace in an unexpected place, with Mark, my best friend. I always admired Mark's keen sense of business and his unwavering loyalty, never suspecting that beneath his polished exterior lay a simmering passion that extended far beyond our friendship. I remember coming home from that trip, expecting the warm embrace of a wife who had missed me. Instead, I sensed a distance that I couldn't quite name. Diana was still the graceful, caring woman I'd fallen in love with, but there was an undercurrent of something else, a secret smile, a fleeting glance that belonged not to me, but to another. For years, I chalked it up to the toll of my absences, never daring to confront the possibility that betrayal might be lurking behind our closed doors. The shock didn't stop there. As if the betrayal by Mark hadn't cut deep enough, fate had another cruel twist in store. In a turn of events I could never have foreseen, Diana began a clandestine relationship with Austin, Mark's own son. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer during a moment of raw honesty, when I stumbled upon a series of messages on Diana's forgotten tablet. The messages painted a disturbing picture, an illicit romance that spanned 2 years, fueled by secrecy and reckless passion. It was as if the life I knew was a carefully constructed facade, and behind every smile and every loving word was a hidden truth waiting to be exposed. Diana's betrayal with Mark was already a betrayal of everything we had built together, but her subsequent relationship with Austin added a layer of twisted irony. I questioned everything I thought I knew about love and loyalty. How could she, the woman who had stood by my side through every hardship, become entangled in a web of lies that reached even into the heart of our closest circle? The tension in our home grew palpable as suspicions began to mount. I had always trusted Diana implicitly, but the evidence was beginning to mount in ways that I couldn't ignore. Austin, with his youthful charm and piercing intellect, seemed the perfect partner for Diana's secret escapades, a pairing that defied all logic. Yet, their connection was fueled by more than just physical attraction. It was a collision of shared disillusionment and forbidden desire. For 2 years, they met in hushed tones and shadowed corners, their rendezvous marked by an intimacy that I could neither comprehend nor forgive. The final nail in the coffin came in the form of a small, inconspicuous device, a phone. Austin, perhaps too confident in the thrill of their forbidden romance, began recording their clandestine meetings. It started innocently enough, a memento of a night they thought would be their escape from reality. But as time wore on, those recordings transformed into something much darker. They were proof, undeniable and irrefutable evidence of the double betrayal that had been festering under the surface of our seemingly perfect lives. I found a phone one evening, tucked away in a drawer that I assumed held only mundane items. The recordings were there, each one a stark reminder of the betrayal that had eroded the foundation of my marriage and shattered the trust between friends. Listening to those voices, Diana's soft laughter, Austin's fervent whispers, it was as though the very essence of my past life was being ripped apart, strand by painful strand. Each word, each secret shared in those recordings, was a testament to the depth of the deception. In that moment, I was forced to confront the reality that nothing in my life was as it seemed. The warmth of our home, the familiarity of our routines, all of it had been built on a foundation of lies. The dual betrayal stung like 1,000 cuts at once, leaving me to grapple with a sense of loss and betrayal that I had never known existed. The man I once was, steeled by years of military service and hardened by the challenges of life, felt utterly defeated by the revelation of a personal betrayal that had outsmarted even his most vigilant instincts. Now, as I sit in the quiet of our home, the evidence of that fateful mistake stares back at me from every corner. I'm left to wonder how a life so carefully curated could unravel so completely, how a woman I loved could find solace in the arms of another, and how the ties of friendship could be so fatally corrupted. The recordings, once just echoes of a forbidden romance, have become a harbinger of a new reality, one in which betrayal and secrecy have redefined the bonds of trust, leaving nothing but shattered fragments of a life I thought I knew. I still remember the day that everything took another sharp, irrevocable turn, one that shattered any fragile hope I had left of a normal life. It wasn't me who discovered the betrayal this time. It was Jonathan. I had always thought my son, with his passion for justice and unwavering sense of right and wrong, was my pride and joy. But that day, something in him changed, and I was powerless to stop it. It happened on a seemingly ordinary afternoon. Jonathan was at a friend's place, a routine study session that had unexpectedly morphed into a night of revelations. Later that evening, as I was sifting through phone calls and missed messages, I received a frantic call from Austin. His voice was strained, almost pleading, as he recounted the events of that night. Apparently, while using a friend's laptop, Jonathan had inadvertently stumbled upon a video file that he wasn't meant to see. The video, raw and damning, captured a series of secret meetings, moments of intimacy between Diana and Austin that spanned too long, illicit years. I remember the sound of his voice, racked with a cocktail of rage, disgust, and shock. Jonathan had found something he could never unsee. He told me, with a trembling certainty, that his hands were shaking as he replayed the video over and over, each time feeling more betrayed than the last. I could hear his heart pounding through the phone, a desperate, guttural rhythm that I wished I could silence with some fatherly reassurance. But instead of calling me back immediately for comfort, he did something I never expected. He grabbed the laptop and bolted, disappearing into the night as if he had been chased by demons. Austin tried to reach out to him afterward to offer some explanation or perhaps a misguided attempt at reconciliation. He said something about feeling trapped, about mistakes made in the heat of passion and the weight of loneliness. But Jonathan wouldn't listen. Every word Austin uttered seemed to echo off the walls of his anger and betrayal, met with a cold, impenetrable silence. I could only imagine the torrent of emotions that must have washed over my son in that moment. How the realization of our family's hidden fractures turned his whole world upside down. What made matters worse was what came next. News of Jonathan's explosive reaction spread quickly among those who were entangled in this dangerous web of deceit. Mark, my best friend for decades, and Austin, who had once been nothing more than a close confidant, were now drowning in their own tide of fear. They realized that the evidence in Jonathan's hands was no longer just a secret between a few misguided souls. It was a ticking time bomb that could blow up our lives in ways none of us were prepared for. I could sense it even before they told me outright. There was a palpable tension in the air whenever I saw them afterward, an unspoken understanding that something irreversible had happened. Mark's eyes darted away when I looked at him, and Austin's attempts to offer explanations fell flat, as if he were reciting lines from a play he wished he could erase. In hushed conversations, away from prying ears, both of them spoke in urgent, trembling tones about the radical steps they might need to take to protect themselves. They were terrified that if I were to learn the full extent of their betrayals, the fallout would be catastrophic, not just for me, but for everyone involved. As the hours turned into days, the weight of this secret became almost tangible. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, haunted by the thought that every knock at the door, every unexpected phone call, might be the harbinger of more devastating news. I spent sleepless nights trying to piece together the fragments of a life I thought I knew, each thought more unbearable than the last. The man I had once trusted implicitly, both my wife and my friend, had betrayed me in ways I could have never imagined. And now, even my own son, my flesh and blood, was caught in the crossfire of their duplicity. The evidence that Jonathan had taken was like a cursed relic, a physical manifestation of every lie and betrayal that had seeped into our lives. In that stolen moment of discovery, my son had been forced to confront a truth too brutal to ignore. I could almost hear his silent screams, feel the burning pain of his disillusionment as he ran away with that damning laptop clutched tightly in his hands. It was a turning point, one that left me questioning everything, my family, my friends, my very identity. I knew then that the storm was not just gathering on the horizon. It had already burst upon us, scattering the remnants of trust and honor into oblivion. In that charged silence, as I awaited the inevitable confrontation, I couldn't help but wonder, could any of us ever rebuild what had been so callously dismantled? Or were we doomed to be forever haunted by the ghosts of our own making, a tangled mess of secrets and betrayals with no hope of redemption? I can still remember the gnawing pit in my stomach from the moment I realized things were spiraling out of control. I had barely processed the fallout of Jonathan's discovery when a new, more terrifying chapter began, one that involved my son being forcibly torn from everything he knew. It happened on an overcast afternoon when I was waiting for a call that I knew would never come. Austin had convinced Jonathan to meet him at an old country house, about 80 kilometers from the city. At first, it was presented as a casual catch-up, a chance to talk through the mess that had been unfolding. But by the time Jonathan set foot on the creaking wooden porch of that secluded estate, an ominous silence had already begun to settle over the scene. According to what I later pieced together, the moment Jonathan arrived, two unknown men emerged from the shadows. Their presence was sudden, almost surgically precise, like predators closing in on their prey. I wasn't there to witness it firsthand, but the details reached me in disjointed phone calls and frantic whispers. One of the calls, overheard in a jittery series of halting words, described how these men cornered Jonathan before his eyes could register the full horror of what was happening. He was roughly pushed toward a waiting van. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed like a death knell. In that instant, the feeling of helplessness that I'd fought to keep at bay transformed into an all-consuming terror. My son, my precious Jonathan, was gone, snatched away as if he were nothing more than a pawn in someone else's cruel game. Hours later, the story took an even darker turn. Jonathan was forcibly brought to an abandoned warehouse, a grim, forsaken place where the air reeked of rust and regret. It was there that Austin and Mark awaited him, their faces a mix of anxiety and cold determination. I later learned that Mark, who had once been my closest friend, now held a gun, its metal glinting ominously in the dim light, as he glowered at Jonathan. The demand was as clear as it was horrifying. Delete the video. The same video that had already upended our lives, the damning evidence of Diana's secret betrayals that Jonathan had discovered and, in his anguish, taken with him. I can still imagine Jonathan's defiant gaze in the face of that threat. Despite the relentless pressure and the unspoken menace in the room, he refused. Every word of Austin's pleading, every warning from Mark, was met with a determination that I now recognize as both courage and desperation. Jonathan wasn't going to let them control him. Not when the truth, his truth, was at stake. It was in that very moment, locked in a deteriorating warehouse, that the true cost of betrayal revealed itself. The stakes had grown far beyond personal pain and familial discord. They had mutated into a dangerous game where the price of integrity was measured in life and liberty. The hours that followed were a blur of muffled sounds and whispered negotiations. I wasn't there, but the snippets of information that trickled through told me that the atmosphere was charged with an electric mix of fear and fatal resolve. Austin's voice, normally so calm and calculated, had been edged with panic. Mark, the man I once trusted implicitly, now seemed like a stranger whose eyes burned with a cold fury. Their plan was clear. They were willing to go to radical lengths to ensure that the incriminating evidence would vanish. And as the minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, Jonathan's unyielding refusal only deepened their resolve. Every time I close my eyes since then, I'm haunted by the image of that desolate warehouse. I picture the sound of footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness, the clink of the gun as Mark adjusted his grip, and the soft, resolute murmur of my son, standing defiant in a place meant to crush his spirit. It was a scene I could have never imagined, a twisted culmination of lies and betrayal, where the bonds of family and friendship were contorted into instruments of coercion. In the aftermath, I've been left grappling with a bitter cocktail of emotions, an overwhelming dread for my son's safety, seething anger at those who dared use our secrets as weapons, and a desperate, gnawing hope that somewhere, somehow, we might yet pull him back from the brink. The fallout from that day has rippled through every aspect of my life, leaving me to confront not just the betrayal of those I loved, but the monstrous consequences of secrets left unchecked. Now, as I sit alone in the quiet aftermath of this nightmare, I'm forced to reckon with the chilling reality. The storm that once promised to shatter our illusions had only just begun. Every decision, every betrayal, and every act of defiance is now part of a treacherous puzzle, one that holds my son's fate in its balance. And as I steel myself for the inevitable confrontation that looms ahead, I can't help but wonder if the cost of truth is, in the end, too high for any one family to bear. I still can't shake the image of Diana's trembling hands as she dialed my number that frantic afternoon, a call that shattered any remaining illusion of normalcy. It was as if the universe had conspired to bring us to this very moment of reckoning. I had begun noticing her unexplained absences, the furtive glances and secretive smiles whenever her phone buzzed. My suspicions, always lurking in the background like an unwelcome shadow, finally took a solid form when I installed a GPS tracker in her car. I thought I was doing it for safety, but deep down I knew I was desperate for answers. That day, as I followed the blinking dot on the GPS, my heart pounded with a mix of dread and determination. The dot led me to an isolated, dilapidated building that radiated a sense of foreboding. I remembered the chilling details of what had happened to Jonathan. The kidnapping, the terror in his voice, the cruel threats that had been made by Mark, my once trusted friend, and Austin. When I saw the location on the screen, every instinct in my body screamed that something was horribly wrong. Moments later, Diana's car pulled up outside the same building. I could see the shock on her face as she took in the sight of those grim surroundings. I watched from the shadows, our fates colliding in that moment of shared horror. She had learned about Jonathan's abduction too, and I could tell that the weight of it was slowly crushing her. The sight of her, so fragile and betrayed by her own choices, only made my resolve burn brighter. I wasn't going to let any more of my family be torn apart by the cruelty of those who had deceived us. Armed with my .45 and a determination forged through decades of military service, I made my way to the building. Every step I took was laden with the memories of my time in the service, when I had learned to act swiftly and decisively in the face of danger. I couldn't afford hesitation now. My son's life was on the line. The building, shrouded in the gloom of neglect, was eerily silent. As I approached the entrance, I could hear muffled voices and the clinking of metal, a sure sign that Mark and Austin were not far off. With a deep breath, I kicked open the door and burst into the room like a man possessed by both fury and desperation. There, in the dim light, I saw Mark with a cold, hard glint in his eyes as he brandished his gun. His face, once so familiar and full of promise, had twisted into a mask of cruelty. Jonathan was there, bound and bruised, but unmistakably defiant, his eyes lighting up with both relief and disbelief as he recognized me. "Let him go, Mark," I barked, my voice echoing off the peeling walls. The sound of my .45 being cocked sent a ripple of panic through the room. Mark hesitated for just a fraction of a second, a delay that I exploited with every ounce of training and instinct I had honed over years of service. In a matter of seconds, I disarmed him with a swift, calculated move. The gun clattered to the ground, and for a brief moment, the room was filled with the sound of stunned silence. I knelt by Jonathan, my heart aching as I checked him for injuries, reassuring him with a steady, fatherly calm that I wasn't about to let anyone hurt him again. "I'm here now, son," I said softly, though my voice still carried the weight of the fury that had propelled me into that room. It wasn't long before the sound of sirens reached our ears. 15 minutes later, the police arrived, their presence a stark reminder that justice was finally catching up to those who thought they could evade it. As the officers moved in to arrest Mark and Austin, I couldn't help but feel a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. There was relief, certainly, relief that my son was safe and that those responsible for so much pain were finally being held accountable. But there was also a profound sorrow, a mourning for the way our lives have been irreparably altered by betrayal and deceit. Diana, still standing a short distance away, looked as though she were caught between remorse and resignation. Her eyes met mine briefly, and in that silent exchange, we both acknowledged the irrevocable damage that had been done. That day, as I led Jonathan out of that forsaken building, the familiar weight of my .45 at my hip was a reminder that sometimes even the strongest bonds are tested by the harshest of truths. I knew there was no simple path to healing from this storm of secrets and treachery. But one thing was certain. I would do whatever it took to protect my family, even if it meant shattering the fragile remnants of a life I once thought I knew. In the aftermath of the storm, when the dust had barely settled and the echoes of betrayal still lingered in the air, I thought I had seen the worst of it. But life has a way of dealing one last, soul-crushing blow just when you think you can finally start putting the pieces back together. It happened during a confrontation I never saw coming, one that shattered the last remnants of my reality. Mark, even as he sat in handcuffs, smirking like a man who had nothing left to lose, still had more poison to spit. He looked Jonathan in the eye, his voice dripping with cruel amusement, and said, "You do know, don't you? That Bruce might not even be your father." The words landed like a gut punch, sucking all the air out of the room. For a moment, everything around me faded into the background. The murmurs of the officers, the distant shuffle of feet, none of it mattered. I looked at Jonathan, my son, my blood, or at least the boy I had spent 24 years believing was mine. His face was pale, his expression a mix of confusion and dread. My mind screamed that it was just another manipulation, another lie from a man who had already betrayed me in ways I couldn't even comprehend. But deep down, some part of me knew that Diana's reaction would tell me everything I needed to hear. I turned to her, and there she was, silent, trembling, eyes filling with tears that had nothing to do with guilt over Mark's words and everything to do with the truth she had hidden for over 2 decades. My stomach twisted into knots as I watched her break right in front of me. She didn't deny it. She didn't scream at Mark for lying, didn't call him a monster for saying something so cruel. Instead, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "I don't know." Those 3 words changed everything. The dam finally burst, and the confession spilled out between gasping sobs. On the night of my first long business trip, back when we were still young, when I still thought we were in love, she had spent the night with a stranger. A one-time mistake, fueled by loneliness and weakness, she said. But that mistake came with consequences, and she had spent all these years living in denial, never truly sure whether I was Jonathan's father or not. I could barely breathe as the room closed in around me. My entire world, already torn to shreds by betrayal and deceit, had just been obliterated beyond repair. I had spent Jonathan's entire life protecting him, guiding him, being the father he needed. And now what? He wasn't even mine? There was only one way to know for sure. A DNA test. Diana sobbed harder when I said it, pleading as if there was anything left to salvage. But I couldn't leave this unanswered. The test was done within days, and the results arrived in a crisp envelope that might as well have been a coffin holding the last pieces of my shattered identity. 0% probability of kinship. I had thought there was no pain left that could touch me after what I had been through. I was wrong. Jonathan sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, reading and rereading the results, his fingers tightening around the paper as if he could will the truth away. I watched him, wondering if he felt like his entire existence had been ripped out from under him, if he saw me differently now, if everything we had been to each other had just disappeared. Then, finally, he looked up at me. His voice was steady, but his eyes were filled with something deeper than pain, something resolute. "You raised me," he said, his voice unwavering. "And that's all that matters." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something break inside me. Not from pain, not from betrayal, but from something raw and real. My son, because no matter what biology said, he was my son, was giving me the only truth that mattered. I didn't need a DNA test to tell me who I was. I had been his father every day of his life. and no one could ever take that away. The final chapter of this nightmare unfolded faster than I could have anticipated. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. I filed for divorce the very next morning. Diana tried to reach out, pleading for a conversation, but there was nothing left to say. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. I refused to give her another second of my time. The legal process moved quickly, and Diana lost everything. With no assets in her name and no support from either me or Jonathan, she packed up whatever dignity she had left and fled to another state, leaving behind the wreckage of her old life. The woman who once thrived on beauty and social status was now nothing more than a shadow, her reputation in ruins, her family gone. Mark, on the other hand, got exactly what he deserved. The trial was swift. There was overwhelming evidence against him. Kidnapping, blackmail, illegal possession of a firearm. There was no way out for him. He was sentenced to 15 years, and when I saw him in court, I barely recognized the man who had once been my closest friend. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of someone who had lost everything. Austin wasn't as lucky as he had hoped either. 6 years as an accomplice. I didn't feel an ounce of pity. They had played their game, and now they were paying the price. Through it all, Jonathan stood by me. He never once wavered, never questioned who I was to him. After everything we had been through, I realized that it didn't matter what a DNA test said. That test was just a piece of paper, a meaningless document that held no power over the bond we had built. One night, we took it outside, doused it in lighter fluid, and watched it burn. The flames consumed the last proof of the betrayal, turning it into nothing but ashes floating into the night sky. Blood means nothing, Jonathan murmured as we stood by the fire. You're my dad. That's all that matters. In that moment, I knew we had won, not just against the people who had tried to destroy us, but against the pain they had inflicted. We had survived, and that was enough. With nothing left to keep me tied to the past, I sold the house. The place that had once been a home was now just a reminder of lies and broken promises. Instead, I bought a quiet, cozy cottage outside the city. Nothing too big, nothing too flashy. Just a peaceful place where we could start over. Jonathan moved in with me, refusing to let the past dictate his future. His experience had changed him. The betrayal, the fight for truth, the corruption he had witnessed, it all led him to switch his major to criminal law. He was determined to make a difference, to stand up against injustice, to make sure no one else suffered the way we had. I couldn't have been prouder. Our lives didn't magically become perfect. The scars remained, reminders of everything we had endured. But in that small house, surrounded by nothing but quiet nights and the promise of a new beginning, we found something we had almost lost: trust, honesty, and support. And that was all we needed.